Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Role of the Juvenile Prosecutor. My name is Allison Friedman, and I am with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the Handouts pod directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file and then click the Download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you're viewing alone, there's no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. This certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via an Adobe Connect thank you email. Please keep an eye on your email for your certificate. Finally, this event will be archived in approximately 3 weeks on OJJDP's online university, where you can also view past webinars. Again, thank you for joining us today. I'll now turn you over to Susan Broderick to begin today's webinar.
Thanks, Allie. Hi, everyone. Oh, my gosh, it's so great looking at the chat and seeing everybody sign in from all over the country. This is really a wonderful opportunity. So I just want to start off by introducing myself. As you can see, I'm Susan Broderick. I'm the project director of the National Juvenile Justice Prosecution Center, and currently working on this project, which is part of the Smart on Juvenile Justice portfolio from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And we've been tasked in creating training and technical assistance materials for juvenile prosecutors across the country. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of my background. Basically spent my entire career working as or on behalf of prosecutors. I started as a prosecutor in the Manhattan DA's office back in 1989, and I spent 14 years there. In the beginning, I dealt with regular cases and worked my way up through domestic violence, sex crimes. I was doing homicides, and it was after a big homicide case, actually, that Mr. Morgenthau called me in and he said, "Congratulations, and I'm going to put you in charge of child abuse." And I'm like, oh, my God, that's a promotion. And but it was actually one of the greatest 3 years of my life working on child abuse cases, because working with children and having an opportunity firsthand to see their resiliency was just an amazing experience. And in 2003, I moved down to the D.C. area, and I began work with the National District Attorneys Association, at first handling child abuse trainings, and then in 2006 I went over to head up their Juvenile Justice Prosecution Center. And then I came over here to Georgetown in 2008, and I've been working on juvenile justice issues ever since. And in fact, it was back in 2007 that I first met my co-presenter today, George Mosey. He was part of our advisory group for the the juvenile prosecution work we were doing at NDAA. And I've met a lot of prosecutors in my years, and in all honesty, George is truly one of the best. And I was so delighted when he agreed to be a presenter in today's webinar, because I think that there's really no better person to learn from George Mosey. So I'm going to hand it over to George now just so that he can give you an introduction, and then we'll start with the webinar.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. And I have to echo what Susan said, but I need to flip it and turn it towards her, because she is a prosecutor's prosecutor. We all look up to her. She's a role model, and she helps to steer the ship. I was a prosecutor for 28 years in Philadelphia. Over the course of my career, I prosecuted cases in federal court as a special assistant United States attorney. I headed up 2 divisions, the narcotics division for 7.5 years and the juvenile division for 13 years. and it was during my time as deputy for juvenile that I met Susan. I retired on December 9th. My last position in the office was the first assistant. My retirement was short-lived, however. On January 2nd, I became the executive director for a nonprofit here in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Anti-Drug, Anti-Violence Network. And in that capacity, I'm interacting with all of the stakeholders that I worked with throughout my career as a prosecutor. So it was a pretty seamless transition, but I'm so happy to be here today.
Thanks, George. So, okay, so let's look at the learning objectives for today's webinar. We will be describing the guiding principles of a balanced approach to prosecution. We will be identifying opportunities for being a public safety advocate in the community and recognize the importance of information sharing and collaboration. Now, we really are truly at a unique moment in time in the field of juvenile justice. Over the past 15 years, at least, there's been a significant change in the juvenile justice system. Firstly, the overall juvenile justice population has decreased by over 1 million youth. We have seen emergence of policies and practices that are supported by data and research, and because of the decline in the caseloads, those working on the front lines have a greater opportunity to work on prevention and early intervention efforts. And while it may be surprising to some, prosecutors in juvenile court have led so many of these efforts. And that's one of the things that we're doing as part of our project is we have a juvenile prosecutor leadership network. And it's comprised of 14 senior level prosecutors. We actually have 2 elected prosecutors part of our group. And we meet twice a year at Georgetown, and it's amazing to hear what they are actually doing in their communities to help youth, help communities, and so we really are at an incredible moment in time.
So, yeah, so that million decrease over that Susan was talking about, I mean, if you think about it, it's really something that's difficult to put your thumb on in terms of how is it that we achieve that. But it's something that prosecutors need to take the time to figure out. And more precisely, we need to figure out what role we played in crime prevention, which is what that amounts to. I can tell you that juvenile justice over the last 100 years has sort of been on a roller coaster ride. And I don't think we've spent enough time figuring out what caused the peaks and the valleys. I know you all remember when there was talk about the imminent creation of super predators and that they were going to be juveniles who would have no compunction about hurting the rest of us. They never manifested to the extent that the person who came up with that theory believed they would. But, you know, there's a real question in my mind about why it is that they didn't manifest. Was the theory wrong at its inception, or is it because of the steps that we took? Is it because of some of the legislation that today is really frowned upon? I think sometimes people look at the end result and forget to really take a close look at how it is that we got where it is that we are. And I'm suggesting to you that prosecutors need to be a part of that analysis. So in terms of present-day juvenile court, you know, we're in this transitional period. And in this transitional period, not only must prosecutors be at the table, but we have to stay educated and up to date on what the latest research is. Many of you know that that research includes scientific findings that relate to young people and their development. We need to be fully up to speed on terms like trauma-informed care, evidence-based practice. In my current role, I really have to be cognizant of what's evidence-based because you can't get funding if it's not evidence-based. I'm really conscious of not just, again, listening to the conclusions about the science, because You know, I'm sure many of you have experienced a conclusion or two in the courtroom that seemed to be based on the facts, but it was really a manipulation of the facts. And I believe that that may be the case sometimes when we hear conclusions that aren't completely supported by what the science actually says. And I think in a nutshell what that means is that we have to be vigilant about, again, not just listening to the conclusions, not just being aware of what the conclusions are, even if the person who came up with the conclusion is wearing a black robe on the Supreme Court. We need to actually take a look at the research and see what the science said. This evolution in juvenile justice has brought us to the point now where so many jurisdictions around the country are employing what we refer to as the balanced approach to restorative justice. And in fact, it's a balanced approach to prosecution. In Pennsylvania, up until 1997, the best interest of the child was the predominant philosophy that was actually articulated in our Juvenile Act. The change was brought about by what I think changed so much in juvenile justice, the fact that people finally recognized that although they're young people, they've done some pretty horrible things, and that there were real victims who actually were victimized by these young people. And so to ignore the needs of victims and, in fact, communities in search of doing what's best for the child was really not only a wrong way to approach this, but an unfair way to approach this. And so we've developed this balanced approach. And as you can see in the illustration, the balanced approach includes three primary sides to the pyramid. The competency development, which is consistent, I think, with the best interest of the child approach, but it goes further than just trying to do what's necessary to make sure that the young person isn't involved in the system again, that they don't recidivate. It actually looks to develop those skills to make sure that they're competent to be successful in the world today. I like to tell people that in juvenile justice we should be striving to give young people who have made bad choices the opportunity to be successful to the extent that we would want our own children to be successful. Community safety, that's what prosecutors are about. And certainly if a young person doesn't recidivate, if they become a viable member of society, then it inures to community safety. But more than that, it means that when addressing the needs of that child, we need to make sure that to the extent possible we can deter them from hurting somebody else, from destroying property, from stealing, whatever it was that they were doing that brought them into the system. We need to make sure that doesn't happen to the extent possible by the supervision, the rehabilitative approach that we designed for that young person. And finally, there's the accountability piece. I frankly don't believe that there can be rehabilitation without accountability. I think that's the way we raise our own children, and it has to be part of the approach that we utilize when we're working with young people in the juvenile justice system. Going back to what I said earlier about the approach being balanced, well, you know, on one side you have the best interest of the child, you have the needs of the child, the competency, but on the other side of the scale you have to talk about victims. That's where we come in. I know you've all been in the courtroom where it seems that everybody's talking about anything and everything but the person who was victimized. And frankly, that's why we're in the courtroom, because somebody was hurt, because somebody had their property taken. We need to support victims, and we need to do it in more ways than just a hug and a pat on the back and some encouragement. We need to do it in a real way, in a tangible way. I think that one of the things that we can do is we can ensure that victims are heard. We can ensure that victims have an opportunity to be in court, to be at the hearing. We need to make sure that victims have an opportunity to know exactly what the system's response is to the conduct that was perpetrated against them. And I think that that is a good segue into the accountability piece. The balanced approach seeks to hold the offender accountable. And I think in doing that, we need to make sure that the defendant, the offender, is conscious of what their actions did and meant to the victims of crime. And if we can do that, I think that we're well on our way to achieving what's in the best interest of everybody involved, actual rehabilitation. When I was the deputy for the narcotics division, one of the things that I was quick to point out was that narcotics offenses are not a victimless crime. You know, some of you have probably heard that you know, it's whether it's substance abuse or actual narcotics trafficking, it's a victimless crime. You know, it becomes obviously a crime where there's a victim when the attendant violence manifests, but otherwise it was viewed as a crime that didn't have a victim. And I like to point out that there's always a victim. They're just not readily identifiable. Because if you lived in an urban area and there was a crack house in your neighborhood, well, you were a victim of crime. If the corner store had been changed into a retail outlet for drugs, well, you're a victim of crime. If the notorious drug dealing that was especially prevalent during the 80s and 90s and continues into the 2000s was right in front of your house, and it caused you to be a prisoner in your own home, well, you were a victim of crime. And I think that the only person in the courtroom who's going to present that perspective to the finder of fact, to the person who is going to sentence the offender or render the disposition in the case of a juvenile, the only person who's going to do that, who's in a position to do that, who will want to do that, is the prosecutor. And so our charge is to make sure that we're there for the victims of crime. I think that's the way that you restore people. And the balanced approach is about restorative justice. And when we talk about justice, I think it's important to remember that as prosecutors, we're not looking for a pound of flesh when it isn't warranted. Frankly, we're not looking for a conviction or an adjudication of delinquency when it isn't warranted. What we're looking for is justice. And the slide equates justice with fairness. There are going to be a lot of people in jurisdictions where you deal with a diverse community who are going to talk about disproportionate minority contexts, DMC. And, you know, for those of you who don't know, the federal government, or at least up to this point, the federal government has made DMC a priority. And what DMC actually connotes is making sure that minorities, that the groups in your jurisdiction are not treated in a disproportionate way, in a way that's unfair to them. So I would start in this discussion, this brief discussion about DMC, by saying that DMC should never excuse conduct, because, you know, that's what the defense is going to try to do, whether it's sentencing or even in the case in chief. If that issue comes up, they're going to try to use it to mitigate, to excuse conduct. The conduct should always be the focus. For me, DMC is appropriately addressed when we're engaged in prevention. And we're going to talk more about the role of prosecutors in prevention. Another aspect to the fairness equals justice piece is the role of prosecutors in ensuring that programs, whether they're programs that are used for pretrial detention, whether they're programs and approaches that probation uses, or whether they're programs that we use at the dispositional stage. Prosecutors have to be completely involved in determining whether or not those programs are operating with fidelity. Programs will pretend to do all kinds of things, and it always sounds great, but if they're not actually doing what they say they're doing, if they're in fact stealing from the citizens of that jurisdiction because their payments come from tax dollars, albeit through child welfare, if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, then as prosecutors, we need to step up and challenge that. Challenge it through the courts. Challenge it at the dispositional hearing when they come in with a flimsy report about the progress of a juvenile and they can't substantiate any of the wonderful things that they say that they did. Or when they come into court and they talk about the inability to do something that they actually advertise the program as being able to do when they were able to secure that referral. The bottom line is that not only is it stealing out of the pockets of the taxpayers, but it's also doing a disservice to the young person who's been in their care. And again, if we're not able to effectively address their rehabilitative needs, then we're doing a disservice to the people that we serve in the community because we won't be ensuring their public safety. Susan, do you have anything to add to any of that?
Well, I do. I am actually thinking about one of the most incredible programs that I've seen, and it's in Philly. And it's the program that you and Bob Listenby started with the Police Academy. And I know we didn't even plan on talking about this, but it came up as you're talking. I'm thinking, wow, we are going to cover that in one of our modules later on. But I was just wondering if you, just for a couple of minutes, could talk or just tell the group about that program that you're doing with the Police Academy.
And so, thanks. It's consistent with what I was saying about best addressing DMC before the conduct manifests. So you want to prevent the delinquency. You want to prevent the inappropriate contact between law enforcement and minority groups so that they aren't arrested, so that there is no crime, and so that you're not dealing with the statistics that usually highlight disproportionate minority contacts. The interesting thing is that the evolution of the word or the term DMC started with disproportionate minority confinement. And so the thought was that we need to talk more about preventing confinement rather than addressing the confinement after it already occurs. And I know as prosecutors, you get sick and tired of having the onus placed on you to address society's ills when what you see is the end result of everything that society has neglected to do. So let me get off that soapbox and get back to what I'm supposed to be talking about. The fact of the matter is that we want to prevent what in many cases are mere encounters between law enforcement and people from the minority community, different cultural groups, religious groups, ethnic groups, racial groups. And we want to make sure that if those contacts occur, that they don't evolve into an arrest scenario. One of the things that we recognized early on was that it often boils down to the relationships between members of the minority community and law enforcement. So we brought a group of stakeholders together from juvenile justice that included Bob Listenby, who ultimately became the administrator for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Programs. Bob, representatives from our child welfare organization, from probation. We came together and we tried to strategize ways that we could address disproportionate minority contact and specifically the poor relationship between young people and law enforcement. We weren't rocket scientists, but we believed that it would help if we brought representatives from both groups together to hear from them as we tried to develop the strategy. So we met, we facilitated a discussion between young people and law enforcement, and an interesting thing happened. We came to the realization that rather than conducting exploratory surgery by doing that, we had actually come upon a potential cure. Because just having the discussion, just allowing them to interact that way, helped them to remove some of the ignorance from the situation. And when they could see that they weren't that far apart, it actually helped to repair and improve the relationships. And so since that time, we've been convening similar interactions throughout the city of Philadelphia. And I guess the pinnacle of what it is that we were able to achieve is that our police academy here has allowed us to do forums for each and every incoming class of recruits that highlights this opportunity to interact with young people. The recruits, quite as it's kept, aren't that old themselves, but it helps them to remember what it was like to be an adolescent. And at the same time, it helps the young people to get in touch with who police officers are. As I said, many of them are still young. Many of them come from the same communities and actually came up just as hard or the same way as the young people. And at this point, it appears, and again, needs to be evidence-based, that attitudes, in fact, have been changed. Susan?
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much. It really is. And I have a link of a video to the program that I can share with Adam, and hopefully we can get it out to anybody who's interested. You can just let us know if you'd like to see it, because it truly is an amazing program that I think should be brought across the country. So now, moving forward in terms of ethics and the role of the prosecutor, this slide, it's quoting the National Prosecution Standards, which we worked with the National District Attorney's Office over the last 2 years to update their standards, specifically as they related to juvenile justice. And one of the things we did was recognizing that, ethics are so important to the role of the prosecutor because there is tremendous power in being a prosecutor. We make decisions on a daily basis that affects people's lives. So, and this standard actually represents the fact that the primary duty is to seek justice. And while the safety and welfare of the community, including the victim, is primary concern, we should also consider the special interests and needs of the juvenile to the extent that we can do so without compromising that concern. So I really do think that it goes back to the idea that, working with our young people is really a very important thing that we can be doing for public safety. And this is reflected, again, in the standards. Now, again, in terms of discretion, one of the things that we did in the standards as well was to recommend to prosecutors, especially the elected prosecutors, just how important the role of the juvenile prosecutor is. And while the discretion is the heart of the function for any prosecutor, the power and the discretion in juvenile court truly is something that requires dedicated and well-trained individuals. And unfortunately, what has happened over the years is in many jurisdictions, juvenile court is just considered a training ground, and people are just put in straight out of law school with really no background and sometimes no interest in working with young people. And so one of the things that we recommended in these revised standards is to really elevate the role of the juvenile prosecutor, the ethical considerations of juvenile prosecutors, and trying to really put it on the radar of the elected DAs of just what an important position this is. And so when we go to charging, and these are, again, some fairly basic prosecutorial functions, is, the charging function is where we exercise a lot of our discretion. One of the things that's really important, and really in juvenile and in adult court, is making sure that we're looking at cases individually and that we're not just charging a case because of the arrest charge. And especially with what we've learned in terms of kids being exposed to things during their childhood and other factors in their lives, we should really be trying to learn as much as we can about these young people, because as George said, our real goal is to turn them into law-abiding citizens or get them back on that track. And we can only do that if we're really looking at each case individually. Now, that being said, we always do have to consider the severity of the crime. And that will always be a critical factor to a determination of what we're going to do with a case. And again, on very serious crimes, sometimes even your juvenile codes might mandate certain sentences. But I think it really, truly is important in terms when you're coming up with a charging decision to make sure you're looking at all the factors and looking to see what other evidence you have, that are their child welfare records or their school records, other things that can help you really try to figure out what's the best thing to turn this life around. And one of the other things that really has taken on a considerable role over, I would say, the last 10 years is more of an interest in prosecutor diversion programs. We held one here at Georgetown almost 2 years ago. We had such an incredible response to it that we ended up having to create another program just to be able to respond to all the teams that wanted to come to this. And it really is a very important part of being a juvenile court prosecutor is the diversion aspect of this, because I think we all know, we've all been teenagers, we all know that sometimes teenagers engage in risky behavior and make stupid mistakes. And I can tell you quite frankly that I look at some of the cases that I see or hear about from juvenile prosecutors in the field, and I just think, but for the grace of God, that could have been me. And I am lucky that I never got in trouble with the law, but I'm also really, I think it's very important that we keep in mind, if not our own teenage years, that of our children or that of the young people in our lives, and recognize that, some bad decisions should not dictate the trajectory of that young person's lives. And if we can turn their life around, we have such an opportunity to do it in juvenile court. So again, listed on these slides are all the different considerations that you may be considering in terms of, charging and in terms of diversion. Now, we will be doing a whole separate module on diversion considerations, and we will get the word out soon as to when that's going to be. But again, just going over these, some of the key considerations. And one of the things, and again, this really goes back to what George was just mentioning with regard to fairness and the decision that we're making decisions that are consistent with respect to similarly situated juveniles. And one of the things that we really have to make sure is that we're not letting race or ethnicity play a role in our charging decisions. And we cover that, again, more closely in our module on ethical considerations. But again, that's just something that we have to make sure that we're just being as fair as we can and making sure that we're not even implicitly making decisions that are not fair. So these, again, are all just very basic things, but very important things that you need to be considering when you're deciding whether to charge, whether to divert, when you're deciding what to do with the case that comes to us. Now, as we have been talking about, there really have been so many changes over the past 15 years, and one of them really has been the expanding role of the juvenile court prosecutor. And what we're seeing is, because we're not tied down to being in the courtroom all the time, we have such an opportunity to work in our communities and really work a lot on prevention and early intervention. So again, one of the best parts of my position is, like I said, I get to work with prosecutors from across the country. This is one of my favorite programs, and it was started back in 2011, and that's the DA right there, Dan Connolly, from the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office in Massachusetts. And he started this program as a way to reach out to children in the communities that they were serving. And it's really made up of volunteers from the DA's office, and they go in once a week to 5 different second grade classes, and they follow these kids up until 5th grade. And I actually was speaking the other day with the prosecutor who's in charge of it right now, and she said it's the best part of her job. And she said everybody who gets involved with this from her office just absolutely loves it, and that the children are so appreciative of it. And one of the reasons that they started the program was it's backed up actually by the findings that children who are read too early in their development are less likely to enter the justice system later in life. So the program is actually part of Dan Connolly's preventive prosecution approach. And again, they also bring in other public figures, including police officers and firefighters. So it's also building on that relationship that George was talking about, and building on early on that people are coming in from the district attorney's office, that the DA and the police, they're not the enemy, they're here to help you, and really trying to establish great relationships with children early on, and also helping them with their reading skills. So this is, again, another program that I would highly recommend. And again, one of those examples where really it's being led by a prosecutor. And you know, when I first came over to the world of juvenile justice, I had spent most of my career in the adult world of prosecution. And one of my first experiences just made me think, like, when did we become the enemy? I feel like everybody just thinks all prosecutors want to do is lock people up. And I can tell you, quite frankly, that of the prosecutors I've worked with in juvenile court, they want to seek justice. And really, I think it's time for the prosecutors to, you know, really start getting more attention for all of the good work they are doing to turn a life around. So again, this is just a program that I think can obviously be done in any jurisdiction, working with the schools, and can really have an incredible impact, not just only on the children, but on the people in the DA's office as well. So again, with regard to keeping apprised of the latest research and the latest developments, and one of the main parts of our curriculum is all about child and adolescent development, and that's our second module. And we will be doing a webinar on that, but it's really looking at just how impactful experiences in childhood can be. And, you know, the trauma-informed phrase, as you will, is really just recognizing that children can be subject to a variety of really negative behaviors. And I had the opportunity to listen to one of the co-investigators of the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And that really was a study that kind of kicked off the trauma-informed movement. And what he talked about was the findings that there are some really identifiable risk factors. And they include, the number one was if a child has been physically or sexually abused. The second most common risk factor was growing up in a home where there are addiction issues. And, you know, again, so it's looking at the cases that we're coming across, and not just looking, like I said before, about the charge, but also looking about that young child's world. and where they're coming from, because that helps us to figure out how to get them back on track. And unfortunately, I think one of the words that is not said as much as it should be is resiliency, because I've learned very early on from working with young people that young people are incredibly resilient. And adversity very often is something we're all going to experience. But adversity can also be an opportunity to experience your own strength. So I think, and I've seen this in the cases when I was handling child abuse cases, where children had been basically to hell and back, and their ability to turn their lives around when they're surrounded by supportive people and especially a caring adult, it's just tremendous. So again, staying on top of all of this research, and that's one of the things that we are charged with doing, is to keep prosecutors informed about the brain science, about trauma-informed care, about the latest and greatest practices. And I see that Melissa Sickmund is on our call today. And again, anytime I need an answer to anything, I go to the National Center for Juvenile Justice, and they have just all the research, all the numbers, and they're just an incredible resource. So I would encourage anybody to, again, reach out to the National Center for Juvenile Justice when they're looking for numbers, and they even have materials particular to each individual state. So now, in terms of getting involved in the community outreach, again, I think Dan Connolly's example up in Boston, but that's not the only one. There's actually another program I heard about, and it is from Massachusetts again, but it's by their DA, O'Keefe. And what he's doing is he's using drug forfeiture money to pay for meditation classes in elementary school. And we're all trying to grapple right now with this opioid epidemic and the drug use with our young people. And one of the things that came out last year was the Surgeon General's report on drug and alcohol abuse and addiction. And one of the major findings of the Surgeon General's report was that, adolescence and young adulthood are critical risk periods for developing an addiction. That addiction is a preventable disease, and that the earlier we intervene, the better. And I think it's in actually the conclusion where they say that the juvenile justice system is truly an early interception point to kind of be able to engage with young people before they get into more serious drug and alcohol use and problems. So if anybody needs a copy of the Surgeon General's report, I'd be happy to share that with everybody.
Let me see if we can go back to that previous slide.
Oh, sorry, George.
That's okay. Yeah, so, earlier through innuendo, I think I said some disparaging things about adolescent brain development theory. I think many of you probably picked up on that. But let me be completely transparent about my problem with the way that that's presented and the conclusions that people rely on in making their various arguments. And it's consistent with what Susan was saying. I believe that what the adolescent brain development science confirms is something that we all knew, that young people are malleable, that their personalities, their conduct isn't firmly established. And for that reason, and the science bears this out, they represent an opportunity for change. They can change. And because they can change, punishment can't be the strategy that we utilize for most of the things that they do. I think I need to establish right off the bat that I believe that we do need direct file. I believe that there is some conduct, there are some things that young people do that means that they're a threat to us, and consistent with what I was saying earlier about deterring that threat and the potential for them to hurt us, they need to be housed in a place that's as secure as possible, and that means jail. But the vast majority of the things that kids do, it's consistent with what Susan was saying about but for the grace of God, there go I. You know, it's stuff that we may have done just because we weren't mature. And for me, if the Supreme Court had said nothing about the brain development stuff, but just said that kids are not mature enough for them to be put to death, I could have lived with that. It would have been fine. I didn't need somebody telling me that it's because the pruning process hasn't been completed. Likewise, when people say things like kids can't make decisions that recognize future ramifications because their brains aren't fully developed, well, see, that's just a lie. That's not what the science says. The science says that their brains are developing as a result of what it is that they experience. And so if a kid has good experiences from the perspective of nurturing, mentoring, guidance, then I don't care what age that kid is, he's going to be better positioned to make decisions based on the wealth of experiences that he or she has had. And I think that everybody on this phone is an example of just that. You're all professionals, you're prosecutors. The fact of the matter is that if you weren't able to make decisions based on future ramifications, well, none of you would have ever made it into law school, probably not undergraduate school. You made decisions because you were thinking about your future. So don't let them tell you. Don't let them tell you that there's a conclusion that flows from the adolescent brain development stuff that doesn't exist. Consistent with the notion that young people represent an opportunity for change, prosecutors need to be involved in developing approaches that actually facilitate that change, that lay that foundation that I was talking about, the positive experience, the experience that's going to help the maturation process, the experience that's going to help them to make decisions that are good for their future. And this slide talks about, community outreach and the things that Susan talked about. I was fortunate to be able to develop a curriculum for 6th, 7th, and 8th graders in Philadelphia that teaches them the consequences of juvenile and criminal conduct. But it goes further. It actually teaches them about American jurisprudence, because I think that with a healthy respect for what actually happens in the United States of America and our court system, if all they hear about are the cases where we got it wrong, if they hear about the guy who got out of state prison after DNA evidence exonerated him, and they believe that, that's the vast majority of the cases that we deal with, well, then certainly they're going to have a bad feel for what it is that we do. They're going to have a bad opinion, and that's going to hurt their respect for the system, and that ultimately hurts them. So we developed this curriculum to teach them about American jurisprudence and to help them to understand that there are plenty of viable jobs, employment opportunities in the justice system that they need to consider, because in the end, we all need to work. This last bullet, law enforcement efforts alone can't solve the juvenile crime problem. I think it increases our credibility when we go out and we're able to articulate that fact. For many years, the commissioner for the police department here and I would tell people that we can't arrest our way out of the problems with drugs and violence. That people are going to have to make the right decisions at some point. And frankly, it's unfair for people to believe that law enforcement is the solution. Unfortunately, in many cases, law enforcement is just the response. But I think that prosecutors can be poised to actually be part of the solution by addressing these issues at early stages. And that's what I believe constitutes pure prevention. If you're elected official, or however DAs become DAs, if they're appointed, if they're not cognizant of the fact that juvenile justice represents a tremendous opportunity for them to go out into the community, to have their platform heard, for people to know who they are and to, in fact, be effective with regard to achieving our primary goal, community safety, well, I think the people on the phone need to express that to them. Talk about the fact that in expanding the role of the prosecutors in your office, you're actually selling the office and all of the good work that we do. And the importance of working with families. If the family is the institution that is best poised to address all the things I've been talking about and Susan's been talking about, then we ought to be out there interacting with families. You know, I'm talking about not just the families of offenders. We need to make sure that they're brought into court. We need to make sure that if there are provisions in your statutory framework that allow you to compel families to be fully engaged with the rehabilitation of their child, we need to make sure that those provisions are utilized. You know, sometimes courts are reluctant to actually get families involved. It's up to prosecutors to make sure that happens. But prosecutors also need to be involved with the families of victims. You know, it's not just the instant victim that needs to be informed about what's going on. We need to make sure that the families that support them are there as well. You know, when you talk about trauma and the impact of trauma, it's pretty clear that sometimes an unresolved traumatic event can result in the victim becoming tomorrow's defendant because they're going to make a bad choice based on, you know, trying to get vengeance or just not being able to deal with the issues that have resulted from the fact that they were victimized. So prosecutors need to be involved with families. It has to be, you know, not just part of our expanding role, but a clear manifest function that we embrace wholeheartedly. All right. Next slide. Information and sharing and collaboration. The biggest difference between dealing with juveniles and dealing with adults is that we have an opportunity that's presented by their involvement in schools. If they're in school, we have them as a captive audience. And we can utilize schools to actually get our message out, to supervise, to surveil. We can do an awful lot if we have collaborative arrangements with the schools, and they're really necessary. There are probably some people on the phone today who shiver when I say FERPA. You know, that acronym means that you're not going to get the information that you need to be effective because of confidentiality. Confidentiality isn't a bad thing, but there are times when the information should be paramount. We need that information, and developing relationships with the schools, making sure that the schools know that we're not there for a pound of flesh, making sure that the schools understand that our role includes prevention will help us to have access to that information. Likewise, we need to educate schools so that schools don't view the justice system as its tailor-made disciplinarian. Some of you have experienced schools sending you all kinds of things. When Susan was talking about our charging decisions, what came to mind to me was that not only do we need to make sure that we're making the right decision based on all the factors cited, but fundamentally we need to make sure that a crime was committed. Because some of the stuff that schools will send to you doesn't constitute a crime. It's incorrigibility. It's a status offense. And we need to make sure that kids aren't being diverted even because of a status offense or because of incorrigibility. We need to make sure that an actual crime was committed, and we need to make sure that schools don't use the justice system as a disciplinarian. And I think I've addressed a lot of this. Information sharing is certainly facilitated by legislation. And in Pennsylvania, we did some things legislatively to overcome the cloak of confidentiality that sometimes precluded us from getting information that would actually help us to better address the needs of juveniles. You know, any defense attorney who's worth their weight in beans is going to tell their client to keep their mouth shut. Well, if you're trying to get information from a kid who has been charged with a delinquent offense and they're taking the fifth, well, it's going to hurt everybody. It's going to slow down not just the wheels of justice, but the wheels of rehabilitation. And so what we did was we actually injected language into our Juvenile Act that precludes using information that's developed during assessment from being used against the kid. So they're protected from self-incrimination. There's no basis for the defense to say you can't give them that information. And then we're able to effectively screen young people, to get them involved in treatment as early as possible, to make diversion decisions because we have all of the information that we need to do that intelligently. And sometimes if you don't have legislation, you can have a memorandum of understanding. We actually developed a memorandum of understanding in Philadelphia that allows the police to exercise their discretion because they get information about young people who, in fact, have committed delinquent acts on school property, but they're minor acts. And so rather than arrest them and bring them into the court system, the police officer can exercise his or her discretion and decide based on all the information that they need to make that decision as to whether or not to actually arrest. That's what we call school diversion. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, George. So I'm sure everybody who's on this call has at some point sat down to interview a child or an adolescent. And we all know that interviewing a young person is much different than interviewing an older person. And actually, when I was preparing for the webinar, it just came to me. I had a case when I was in New York in the child abuse unit, and it was a little girl who had been sexually abused by her mother's boyfriend. And she was 4 years old. And she would, every time she would come to my office, she would put a chair against the door. I mean, this girl was so traumatized, it was unbelievable. And at one point, she wanted to talk to me, and then she crawled under my desk. So I got underneath my desk in my skirt suit and talked to her down there. Because, again, with kids, a lot of times we have to go to where they are to communicate with them. And I know that I have nieces and nephews who are in their teens right now, and some of the lingo and jargon that they use, I don't understand. So, again, as part of working the best that we can on these cases, we need to keep ourselves familiar with the latest jargon and what's going on the internet and social media and all of that. And one of the things I also wanted to say before heading into the conclusion is that one of the best books I can recommend on the adolescent development issue is Larry Steinberg's Age of Opportunity. And in that book, Larry Steinberg, who many see as really the grandfather of, or maybe the father, and maybe I'm dating him, but of the adolescent brain research. And one of the things that he says in that book is that, you know, the findings that we've had recently about the adolescent brain, and like George said, it's not really new. We've known that kids are different than adults since 1899. And the other thing that we know, and this actually wasn't Larry Steinberg, this is my personal point, which I had a discussion with somebody from NCJJ about this, is when we look at the population within the juvenile justice system, it's about 2% of the overall youth population in this country. So it's really a small, small, small amount of young people. So they're not coming in because their adolescent brain is deformed. They're coming in because they made a bad decision, and sometimes that bad decision involves a really serious crime. So we have to take that really into consideration when we're looking at the adolescent brain research. And the other thing that Larry Steinberg says is what is new is the fact that we now know more about the plasticity of the brain and how it is malleable for a longer period than we originally thought. We go back, I don't know, 20 years. We all thought that, the key learning period for children is between 1 and 3. And that's why, like, baby Einstein videos, all of that. It's like, we got to get in there between 1 and 3 because that's when the brain is developing. That's when we can have the most impact. What the science shows us, it's actually really good news, is that, the brain is still developing until 24. We had Jeff Butts, who is really an amazing expert in the field of juvenile justice, and he came and spoke to our Juvenile Prosecutor Leadership Network. And he said, the adolescent brain research is about plasticity and the fact that kids can and do get rehabilitated for a longer period than we thought. That what he explained was that, if somebody does something really bad at 16, there's a chance to turn that young person around. Whereas if somebody at 30 or 40, it's really hard to change somebody and change the trajectory. So I just think in terms of when we're looking at the adolescent brain research, again, I highly recommend the Age of Opportunity. I'll share the link, and that can be shared with all of you. But it's a phenomenal resource. So now, in terms of winding down here, George and I can chime in on this together. But again, I'm just really excited that there's so many people on this call, and that I feel like it is a time where we can be doing so much good in our communities, especially in terms of prevention and early intervention, in terms of working with kids and making sure that they are not only that we're looking at the risk factors, but perhaps more importantly, that we're working to increase protective factors. And the most important protective factor is a caring adult. So in terms of looking into a young person's orbit and trying to identify there's somebody there that, because some of these kids are not going to find that positive caring adult in their family. And it's sad, but it's a reality, and that's where we have to, maybe work with our social services departments and really try to find people that can help support a young person, maybe through a program. George, do you have any other words for conclusion?
I think you said it all, but, I would just emphasize what we said earlier about this being an opportunity. It's a place where you can really effectuate prevention, and you can change the lives of some young people without doing a whole lot that's complicated or sophisticated. It just boils down to spending some time with them. And the juvenile justice system, the evolution to where we are today, I think puts us in a position to be well poised to do all those things as prosecutors.
And before we go to the questions, I just wanted to share, and this is actually a Larry Steinberg quote, is adolescence is our last best chance to make a difference in a young person's life. And I think that when we look at the brain research or anything about working with young people, this really truly is an opportunity to turn a life around. And I think that's why in the DA's offices we have to recognize just what an important role the role of a juvenile prosecutor is. So with that, we have a couple of questions here. George, has your police program in Philly been evaluated or studied?
It's being evaluated now, but what we're really seeing is the drastic reduction in cases that emanate from the schools. And so, we want to make sure that recidivism is what is low as a result of young people going into the program. We want to make sure that their needs are addressed, but certainly at first blush, we're convinced, and the statistics bear out that it's drastically reduced the number of cases that come from the schools.
That's great. And somebody else requested if we could email the video link. So Adam said that it will be included in the online university archive along with this webinar. There was another question about diversion programs with prosecutors and offices, and there are many, many examples of diversion programs. not sure exactly who asked that question, but if you want to follow up with me after the webinar, I can give you some examples. I know, George, you've done a lot of work on diversion.
Oh, yeah, and many are run right out of our office. Our youth aid panels, for example, where we actually have people from all over the city of Philadelphia volunteer to serve on panels. It's the best example of community justice. That's run by our office exclusively. You know, we screen the young people who will participate, and we make sure that the panels are trained, and we keep tabs on them to make sure that they're seeing all the young people. I saw my friend Melissa Sickman was on the call, and she has a wealth of information about diversion programs as well.
Oh, that's right. Yes, thanks. Okay, now we have a question about getting more involved in community service. We are working with some local residential treatment centers in New York. I know that, and this is actually something I should have mentioned earlier, when a few years ago I was in Colorado with meeting with their juvenile court prosecutors from across the state, and they were working using a program called Phoenix Multisport in their drug courts and with their probationers. And basically it was for young people who had drug and alcohol problems. It was a connection. They were using that during either as a condition of probation or introducing the youth to it during the drug court process. And what it is a sober, active group of young people. And again, it's about what happens after treatment, because very often what we see with the drug courts is that we hold a graduation ceremony for people and we don't connect them within the community. So it's really what happens after treatment. So I have plenty of resources about what we can be doing to work with local treatment facilities in terms of improving the outcomes for the young people that are in treatment. So please, whoever posted that question, please feel free to follow up with me and I can give you some more resources about that. So, which offenses are usually coming from the school?
So some assaults on police officers. The grading of an assault is actually increased when the assault is on a police officer in Pennsylvania. It goes from a misdemeanor to an aggravated assault, even though the severity of the assault is a misdemeanor in terms of the substance. We can talk to the police officer, the officers who arrive on the scene to address the incident can ascertain from the victim whether or not, it was a push or a punch to the face, and based on that, they can decide whether or not to divert. Some of the other cases, and maybe some of you have heard about the horror stories of where, a kid brings a pair of scissors to school and they get caught going through the metal detector and they're charged with possession of a weapon. Those are cases that we can divert, and it's palatable to divert because we get the information about the kid. That's where it's really imperative that the schools share information. Now, if you find out that this is a kid who had beef with another young person and there was an altercation the day before, well, that sheds a different light on the pair of scissors. But you find out that this is a kid who, is working on some stuff where the scissors are a part of the project. Well, that's pretty helpful in making the diversion determination. But those are the kinds of cases. They're minor cases that, frankly, would have been diverted if an arrest had been made. What this does is it obviates the arrest, the photo, and the fingerprinting. And what we've injected into the process in Philadelphia is substantive supervision. So every young person who is diverted actually goes to our intensive prevention services through our Department of Human Services, where they have mentoring, where they're able to engage in wholesome activities, where we can keep tabs on them. And that certainly helps with the ultimate evaluation of the program.
And I just saw Melissa Sickman from NCJJ had a comment So just because you can bring a kid to court doesn't mean you have to, and I totally agree with that. And I think that was one of the problems we were seeing with the school offenses. I remember being down in a meeting in Louisiana, and it was actually the juvenile prosecutor who was pushing back with the school, and she said, you know, I'm not your vice principal of discipline. And I think that that's where we have to make it very clear. So, you know, again, we have to be looking at these cases. Nobody wants to charge somebody who doesn't have to be charged, but we also have to recognize that sometimes that is necessary, and sometimes, again, the safety of the community and victims have to be part of the consideration, and I think that, again, that's a very important part of the role of the juvenile court prosecutor. So I just want to thank everybody. This has been wonderful, and again, feel free to follow up with me with any questions or comments. I know that we will be sharing some more information along with the PowerPoint on the online university. So I guess that's it, and thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, George.
Thanks so much. Yeah, the webinar will be archived in 3 weeks on the online university, so definitely check back and find it there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
The host has left the meeting, so at this time, the meeting will come to an end.